I wanted to create a self-help podcast where I could tell my story and other people's stories to explore the human experience. I firmly believe that we don't need to spend thousands of dollars. Really, it's on us. For me, I needed to find the practical side of it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mitch Lieber. Welcome to Grounded for Life. I wanted to create a self-help podcast where I could tell my story and other people's stories and really create an accessible sort of platform where people can get good advice and kind of hear what other people have done to get through sticky situations, tough parts of life. Really, I wanted to create this podcast to explore the human experience through storytelling. And what a better way to do that than to kick it off with my story. So at 5 years old, I was a very hyperactive kid. I was getting in trouble with family parties and that sort of stuff. Well, I actually got diagnosed with ADHD around that age, as well as anxiety. So that really created a very specific type of public schooling experience for me, where I was on an independent education plan. I was in specific, they called it modified classes, where the material was a little bit easier to understand and that sort of thing. And we even, took a look at sending me to a different school outside of like the public sphere. The reason being is that I really didn't understand socializing, and so they had put me into like special classes for like social skills. It was literally called social skills. So, childhood outside of that was pretty normal for me. We did move around a lot, but I spent most of my formative years between Philadelphia and a small suburb outside of Baltimore. So eventually we ended up in New Jersey, and much like before, there was this pattern of being picked on because I didn't understand socialization and boundaries and like that sort of stuff. So I ended up going to a private school that was specifically for kids with ADHD and different social things going on. And, it wasn't all that bad. I really enjoyed the people I went to school with, and we got to play dodgeball, which not a lot of schools do these days, I think. But dodgeball was just a great way to kind of blow off some steam and have a little bit of fun. But as I got older, my priorities started to shift. The one thing that was constant for me was always trying to find a group of friends that would accept me for who I was, right? So I went to very extensive lengths to get that sort of acceptance. So I met a friend who didn't live too far away from me, and we bonded over skateboarding, over punk music, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, all the typical like millennial starter kit type stuff. It was really the good old days. So that motivated me to go to a public high school. And so when I got there, I really was very happy about it and found a bunch of people I liked and kind of joined this group of skateboarders where we were just skateboarding in different plazas, getting kicked out for loitering, going to the skate park, that sort of thing. This pattern of bullying ended up reemerging, and I think it ended up pushing me towards like what we call emo. The emo scene was enormous back in that time period. It was the early decade of the 2000s. It was the early part of the 2000s. So that was really the golden years of when the scene was at its absolute peak. It is nowhere near what it was back then. So that ended up being a pretty good time. I was in a band that everyone hated because we always played like on different wavelengths. So the music wasn't really all that cohesive. But there were a lot of other great bands in that scene. Eventually I got a little tired of it and ended up becoming sort of a stoner and reuniting with a couple people from like the group from early high school. So things were good for a while. You know, we just spent a lot of time listening to some really good music. I got exposed to things like early Incubus, which I didn't even know was a thing. If you haven't heard Incubus's first two albums or the EP in full length, go listen to it. It's incredible, completely different band. But I digress. Things were good for a while, and then eventually that pattern of bullying reemerged. Sprinkle in a little bit of harder drugs in the mix, not by me, but certainly by people in that group. And those little instances of bullying turned physical. And I was so glued to just being accepted that I did nothing but just take it and blame myself, which is, in hindsight, you know, a little mixed up, right? To say the least. Well, things took a turn for the worse right before I was going to go to college and senior year was ending. So we had driven across the George Washington Bridge into Washington Heights to pick up something. And we ended up getting pulled over. And my registration was out of date, technically, but you know, in the state of New Jersey, it was still there. I just didn't have the documentation. So we ended up getting a ticket. And the person who drove my car, well, he had a bunch of sort of things going on with him at the time. And so what ended up happening is he was flipping out over this $100 ticket, speeding my car down the highway and beating me in the side of the head with the ashtray from my 1999 Toyota Sienna. So, yeah, it was really rough. And my first 3 weeks of college, this entire section of my ear, this was all like purple. I looked like a Smurf. It was just bruised to shit. So that's really how I started my college career. And college was, I would say, a very healing time for me because I got to really make a group of friends who didn't treat me like absolute trash. And that was really the first instance of meeting people that actually respected me for who I was. There were certainly people that made fun of me, but eventually they just kind of realized that I'm, I guess, apparently a good dude. And so they just stopped. And things were great at that point. But I didn't realize how traumatized I was by all these like occurrences during high school. So college was definitely a time of partying and really just focused on like coping. So I wasn't really all that interested in dating and that sort of stuff until towards the end of college. So I found myself in a relationship that it was 3 years. We had a good time and things ended up kind of just changing. I changed and kind of grew apart. And so we ended up breaking up. So I wanted to really continue that level of partying that I was doing in college. So I found a group of friends that I coincidentally had gone to high school with, but they were in a separate group of people. And I would have never hung out with them in high school besides having classes with them. So things were great, but it was just sort of this codependent like group of friends where, you know, again, it was just prioritizing like socializing over anything else. So like, did I go on a bunch of dates? Yeah, more towards my mid-20s, I did. And that was great. But I kind of started to realize that, like previous situations, I had been giving my boundaries and my sovereignty away to be accepted by a group. And so what that meant is I was neglecting my own needs. And little by little, I had started to wake up to that notion. Well, eventually that bullying pattern caught up with me again. And this time I actually listened and I removed myself from the situation and didn't talk to that group for a while. I even went as far as like getting an apartment closer to where I was working and closer to where some of my friends from college were living in New Jersey. So I think that really helped. And then eventually I found it within myself to start utilizing forgiveness to really reconnect with some of that group of friends, and things have been great with them ever since. I then found myself in probably my first legitimate, like, serious relationship, and that kicked up all sorts of stuff. I'll be like, the first one to admit that like the things that came up, I didn't even foresee them, and it made the relationship, it made the relationship very difficult. So it was very much my teacher. There were some really good times in that relationship and some really tough times. So those tough times, they started to awaken something in me where all of a sudden I was just having these thoughts like, what is going on with my life? I don't like the way it's going. I need to do something about it. And so that's when I reignited my intrigue into more spiritual approaches. My friend at the time recommended this somatic bodywork type treatment called Traeger approach. Now, Traeger approach is one aspect that this clinic uses to create their own somatic modality. Well, I was so like tight that, sorry, this is low power mode. I was so tight that it took me about 6 months to learn how to like allow my leg to loosen so that the therapist could actually move it and do the actual work. So like that goes to show like how cranked up I was. Well, that started to just unravel a bunch of things and peel the layers off the onion. So the relationship ended, and I'd gotten deeper into more spiritual work. I had started taking yoga classes. I had started meeting with this specific shaman, and we were doing like what's called a sopla, which is a cleansing ritual involving tobacco smoke and a lot of drums. Super fun. But it seems like nothing. It seems like placebo. But that was very impactful for me, where it started to like continually pull up the deeper things that we weren't getting to in the somatic bodywork. And so I found a very interesting method of release. Now, of course, nothing is for free. So I spent quite a bit of money going through that stuff. And eventually that resource ran dry and I needed to move on to something else. So I ended up being introduced to someone who ascribes themselves as a Vedic shaman and started going to do all these different Vedic rituals, including a Furba dagger ceremony. Don't worry, no one was hurt. Just got to put that out there. But he was big into what's called the Vedic astrological chart. And so this search that I was on, I kept on thinking that this next like person, teacher, mentor would be the person who would find the cure for me to feel better about myself. Little did I know that the only person that holds that power is sitting right in front of you. So I continued to do these studies and kind of really put a lot of stock and energy into these things. And then the pandemic rolled around. So, I had about 6 months to really get over a relationship. And then this crazy world event happens and just pushes me right over the edge. I turned into a hypochondriac. I dropped 30 pounds. And I was a healthcare worker, so I had to come in. I was an essential worker. And although I wasn't in the actual like COVID units, it was still ground zero. So imagine how traumatizing that is as someone who's already anxious and is turned into a hypochondriac, popping vitamins and doing all this crazy shit to try to, basically allay like fears of what would happen if I came down with COVID previous to having any vaccination. So things eventually opened up and I was just definitely on the careful side. A lot of my friends will remember me not wanting to do indoor parties and like masking and all that stuff, and ultimately caused so much stress between just the actual environment that we were in, working in healthcare, doing stupid things like taking vitamins on an empty stomach. I ended up with a freaking stomach ulcer and had to go and deal with all that. So, that was right around when the vaccine came out and I had early access. So I went ahead and got it because I was certainly terrified of the possibility of getting sick. Once I got the vaccine, I just really stopped caring and continued doing some of these spiritual practices. And eventually I found myself in this situation where I got COVID summer of 2021. It was when the Delta variant was going around. And man, did it make me really sick. I wasn't hospitalized, but I was sick for about 3 weeks. And I think between all the drinking and all the burning the candles at both ends, I really didn't set myself up to do too well. So things got better. And I had a vacation in Colorado, ironically, 2 weeks after I got better. And so everything was just about trying to recover and get well enough so that I can enjoy my time out in Colorado. Because those of you who have been out here in the summertime, it's all about the outdoors. It's all about the hiking. It's all about the mountains. It's all about the scenery. And you have to deal with altitude. So that was a priority. So I got out here and had a really good time and ended up falling in love with the place. And this apartment that you see me in is literally located in the northern end of Denver. So I made it. But when I got back, I was so distraught about like coming back into that environment. And, on top of that, there was just some side effects from having COVID. I really did have a lot of GI related things. So I went back on a specific medication. I'm not going to name names, but this medication is highly controversial, and they are very careful about who they give it to out in Europe and countries where they're actually responsible with things like prescription drugs. So I ended up back on these things, and I didn't really feel like they were really helping me, and I felt like it was a Band-Aid. So I cold turkeyed it and had this horrible sort of bout of like just reflux for months. And in that time, all of a sudden I'm developing these food sensitivities. So dairy was the first thing to go. Then I figured out after 2 months of suffering that gluten had to be removed from my diet. So you can imagine just how traumatizing it is as someone who loves food, having to go and remove that stuff. And I had tried a bunch of different things, but I thought I had allergies at one point. I actually did have that stomach ulcer. Like I was just chasing my tail and going from like different like principle of medicine to different principle of medicine. Eventually I realized that getting off that stuff entirely was the right move and just controlling everything through diet. And so once I did that, everything got much better. But I was traumatized and still trying to chase after how I could cure myself, which is really all not that great. So I ended up like working with functional medicine and trying all these supplements and these cleanses and stuff. And some of those things did help. The cleanses really didn't. And I ultimately figured out that like it was creating more stress, and the stress is what was really flaring things up. Right around that time, I had started getting a little, I guess, agitated with like just being in the Vedic shamanic community. And so I ended up like going to a free meetup and meeting a Peruvian shaman. And much like me, he was kind of the black sheep of his family. And he explained to me that shamanism can be viewed as a religion, but it's also a logic. And so to me, like that really jumped out at me because I was just fed up with the dogma. I've always been someone who has not wanted to be part of any sort of like a religious establishment from like 5 years old. So it just rubbed something the wrong way. And I think for me, I developed a really unhealthy relationship with astrology where I was looking at it like, oh, my life will get better in this time period. But as I've learned really this year, there are no absolutes. And anyone who gives you absolutes, like they're just doing their best to help you. But it really like absolutes don't exist. Even in science always changes, right? So I ended up leaving that community after I realized that I was giving my power away. And not that it's really on them. That's more of a me decision, the way I was approaching things. But it really stirred something. And so, like, I started thinking about how long have I been giving my power away? And the answer is most of my life. I've been putting other people before me up until really when I turned 28, 29. So it really just sparked this sort of anger, and I had to work through that. Additionally, I was on the job search looking for work out in Colorado, which ended up taking 10 months. The reason it took so long, I think, number one, is my attitude. Number two was the industry. And number three was just, the state of the world. We're going through a pandemic. Things are uncertain. Everything's a little confusing. So I ended up getting a job and moving out here. And I did not really account for the amount of growth that I would have. About a year prior, I had started messing with working with mediums and like tarot cards. And eventually I found one of my more recent mentors on YouTube, and his stuff was awesome. So I went and got a reading from him. And what struck me the most is that I had all these things I wanted to ask him, but he just threw cards at me and like told me, what was coming to him versus like what I wanted to know. And, at the time I was like very confused and just like, what the heck is this? But as time went on, I kind of found that stuff to be a little more useful. So I got out here and I ended up signing up for a class called Intuitive Development. And we literally just wrapped that up last week. Well, it was 20 weeks with a break in between, taking a look at different principles of mediumship. And in my spiritual journeys, I'd come across all these things. And as I started to learn about them, I started to think about practical ways to apply them to my life. Like, I'm a very open-minded individual, but there's just certain things that do and don't resonate with me. And so, like, I think, in bouncing around from spiritual mentor to spiritual mentor, I think the most important thing is how these principles can improve our lives and how we can look at them in a grounded way where we're not getting too caught up in the spirituality. I'm not talking poorly about those who are. If that's your belief system and that works for you, great. For me, I found that all religions, all philosophies, we're all trying to understand why we're here, what this concept of God is, and if there's something beyond this material world. I personally think there is, but there's plenty of people who think that there isn't. I'm not here to debate that or tell you what to believe. But this mediumship course helped me find a deeper sense of connection with myself through learning how to utilize my intuition, because apparently I have a ton of it. And so like developing that into a set of tools that would help me live a better life, to me, there was a lot of value in that. So as that stuff was going on, or just having all these traumatic releases, there was always these emotional explosions. And, some of that was triggered by like this OCD sort of need to try to control my microbiome and ultimately fix my gluten issues. Meanwhile, I'm like basically overdosing on probiotics and doing all this crazy stuff. I tried keto. I have no body fat. Like, what am I doing keto? And it got to a point where I just couldn't do keto anymore. I switched to paleo, and that ended up jacking up my cholesterol. So I had to like figure out a way to just try to get it down. To me, like the most sensible thing was vegetarian. So I tried that, and then I had all these like thyroid problems and my muscles were hurting because I work out a lot. And guess what? You need amino acids. And, I've tried branched chain amino acids as like a form of supplementation, but when you have ADHD, apparently those interrupt your neurotransmitters, and I felt all like loopy and bipolar. So that stuff didn't work. So I got to a point where I just kept on having emotional explosions and implosions, and really it didn't happen until recently when I met someone who just showed me what being calm is like. And, once I saw that, I was like, I want to do this for myself. There's got to be a better way for me to live my life where I'm not so high strung and stressed out about stuff, because I'm just tired of doing that. So little by little, I started like actually pulling up all these traumas from my life. And as I was doing it, I started developing like all these crazy stomach problems. I felt like shit. I was lethargic. My muscles hurt. I couldn't think straight. I had brain fog. And as soon as I like really resolved things and had difficult conversations, these things started to go away. And so that made me realize that it's not supplementation. There's nothing wrong with my microbiome. It's the way that my stress response is set up. I'm in flight or fight more often than I am in rest and digest. So that just goes to show like how insanely tuned the body is. A lot of these issues, diseases, food intolerances, all these things are likely caused by stress. So, the reason I'm telling you this story is I really think this could be beneficial to you if you're going through difficult parts of your life. So I wanted to just set up an open forum where, number one, like I said in the beginning, I'm telling my story. Number two, I'm making self-help and impartial advice more accessible, where it's not this $5,000 program. Do I want to monetize this eventually? Yeah, so I can make better content for all of you and really get to enjoy this process, because I love creating stuff. I love writing music, and communication wasn't always my strong point, but it's certainly something that is a newfound muscle, and I plan on flexing that and taking it to the gym. And what better way to do that than to stare awkwardly into a camera and do like literally the 10th take of like me trying to tell you my story without tripping over my own tongue. So this is the best way for me to get these messages across, not just start some program where I'm demanding $5,000 for like 6 weeks. I'm not knocking those programs, but I'm just saying like not everyone has money. We live in a really weird economic time period right now. So access is important. And I think the most important thing is storytelling. I don't want to just do like deep dives into spiritual stuff. We'll have room for that. And I'd rather ease you in comfortably where I'm not just throwing crazy things at you like tarot cards and like speaking with like deceased loved ones and that sort of stuff. Like those things are very interesting and I've gotten to experience some of that stuff, but I think what is more relatable is storytelling. And I would like to have people on who have done things like quit their 6-figure career to start a clinic or started from the very bottom of certain industries and worked their way up to like the vice president level at, like senior management. So I think that there's a practical way to present these spiritual principles, people's stories, and bits and pieces of advice. So I'm really happy to have you here, even though, right now it's like an invisible audience, but I'm very happy to finally get this episode cranked out, and I hope to see you soon. Thanks.